Masechet Ketubot Daf Mem Chet. We continue with the list of items that a husband is responsible to provide for his wife. The Tanna Kama gave a whole list, and then Rabbi Yehuda added, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afilu Ani B'Yisrael, even the poor person has to provide for his wife at least 2 flutes and 1 professional wailer at his wife's wedding to give honor to his wife. Now, Tanna Kama did not say anything about this, so does he agree? Does he disagree? Let's see. Mikelal de Tanna Kama sabar hanila. So we can infer that Tanna Kama says that a husband is not required to provide for his wife any flutes and any wailers. So let's see, what exactly is the case? What is the common custom? If it's the common custom that everyone does get flutes and wailers, then how come Tanna Kama says it's not required? This is a basic necessity of respect that should be provided for. The husband is required to pay for the burial expenses, basic whatever it is, basic burial expenses. If this is how everyone does a funeral, then it should be included. And if they're in some place where this is not the custom to have flutes and wailers, then why does the Yehuda require it? Nobody's doing this. So we have a compromise. It could be that there's a difference between their social statuses or their family common customs. So if it's a place where it is his custom to have flutes, but not her custom to have flutes and wailers. So when there is a difference in the standards of living between the husband and wife, what is the prevailing rule? Does he have to provide her regarding other things too? When he has to provide her for with clothing and food, is at what level? Where can she shop? So Tanna Kama sabar ki amrinan ole imo ve'ena yoredet imo hanemile mechayim aval achad mita la. Oh, so very good. We actually have a very important general rule that we say ola imo, she rises up with him. In other words, if he comes from a higher social class than she does, then she rises to his level. So if he's used to shopping in expensive stores and eating expensive restaurants, then she has to be treated the same way as him. She rises to his level. And on the other hand, if she is from a higher class than he was, she does not have to go down to his level. Rather, the husband has to provide her what she was used to growing up. So in other words, she gets the benefit of both sides. She gets the higher of the two, whether it was her family or his family. Now, all that's true when she's alive, regarding all the benefits that she deserves while she is alive. But there's an exception. After death, that's not true. After death, husband has to give her only what her family is used to. So therefore, yeah, if her family is used to having flutes, then he would have to provide it. But our Mishnah is talking about a case where her family does not usually have flutes, but rather his family does. So therefore, Tanna Kama says, since she died, he does not have to provide her the higher level of his family, but rather the lower level of her family. But Rabbi Yehuda says this rule that you pick the higher of the two applies both when she's alive and also while she's dead. So since his family always has flutes, he has to provide that for her. Amarav Chista, Amarav Ukva, halacha Rabbi Yehuda. And the final halacha is in fact like Rabbi Yehuda, that he would have to provide for her the higher of the two levels, even for funeral rites. Amar Chista, Amar Mor Ukva, Mi nishtata betin yordin linchasa vezanin mfanesin et ishto banav notav v'dabar acher. Okay, another law by Rav Chista in the name of Mor Ukva, that if a man became insane, and so now he's no longer competent to deal with his finances, but he does have financial obligations, so the Bet Din will step in and take control of his funds. And so they have to act responsibly. So they can provide sustenance, food and sustenance for his wife. Well, that's a basic obligation in the Ketubot. So it's a legal obligation. He's got to pay for his wife. Good. banav benotav, and his children. He has to provide sustenance to them. V'davar acher, and another thing. We're going to see a machloket about what that other thing is. One of the opinions is that it's talking about jewelry, cosmetics, perfume for his wife. So beyond just basic necessities of staying alive, he has to provide the cosmetics also for his wife. Okay, that's the law. Amar le Ravina le Rav Asher, Ma'ishna mehad Tanya. Now Ravina asks Rav Asher, hold on, we have a contradictory law. So what can you explain to me the difference? The Tanya. מי שהלך למדינת הים ואשתו תובעת מזונות, בית דין יורדין לנכסיו וזנין מפרנסין את אשתו. So here we have a case not of a man who became insane, but rather someone who went away on a trip. And he didn't come back for a long time, and the wife comes to the court and said, he didn't leave any cash around, he didn't leave food around, but he has an obligation to feed me, and he has property and assets in the town. So she comes to Bet Din. So Bet Din says, yes, you're right. He has an obligation to feed you, and therefore the Bet Din, since in his absence, that's how it's similar, right? The person who's insane is physically absent but mentally not around. This guy is mentally sound, but he's physically not around, so he can't make the decision. So the Bet Din make a responsible decision for him, and they go and go into his assets, and they feed and provide all the basic needs for his wife. But they do not take money to pay for the sustenance of his sons, his daughters, and not for that other thing, let's say which is cosmetics. So this is interesting. What's the difference between the one who goes insane and the one who goes away on a trip? That one should be required, and one they do take money for their kids and cosmetics, and the one who goes away on trip, they don't take the money they don't feed the kids and have him pay for cosmetics. Amar le, Rav Asher answers, ben yoseh ladat, ben lo yoseh shelo ladat. Says, don't you think there's a difference between someone who leaves willingly, that's the one who goes on a trip, and someone who goes not knowingly, I mean the one who goes insane. So here's how it works. The person who goes insane, since before when he was sane, he was providing all these things for his wife, for his children, and cosmetics, and so now they went insane. We assume that he would want to provide all these things in the same level as he had been doing before. So therefore the Bet Din goes ahead and does it at the same level. Whereas the person who goes away on a trip, he knew he was leaving, and so he should have made plans for the basic necessities. So he didn't make plans. He didn't leave over money. Therefore, we cannot assume that he wants to pay anything more than he actually provided for, or that he's legally obligated to. So what are the fundamental basic legal obligations of a man? Well, in the Ketubot, he has to provide food, sustenance, clothing for his wife. So that the Bet Din will seize his assets in order to pay for that. But children, surprisingly, is not so. It actually depends on how old the kids are. If they're younger than 6 years old, then yes, the father has an absolute obligation. We can seize his assets in order to provide food for his very young children under 6. But it's surprising halakha. If they're older than 6, then although it's absolutely expected, and we would shame any deadbeat father who doesn't feed his children who are above 6. Nevertheless, there's no absolute legal obligation. I guess 6-year-old could Oliver style fend for himself somehow and beg or find some way to access communal funds. Right? It's not like they're just in a crib that they're going to starve to death. So above 6, while there's a basic human responsibility for a father to provide, but there's no absolute legal responsibility. Therefore, in absence of the father who goes away, and considering that he didn't leave any funds for his 8-year-old kids, therefore, the Bet Din cannot take his funds. Instead, they'll have to refer the kids to the local charity organization. Also with cosmetics. Cosmetics is above and beyond. And would a husband in his absence want his wife to look beautiful? Maybe, maybe not. For the insane person, we assume, well, he paid for all these things, so his wife looked beautiful when he was sane, so we assume that he would continue when he sees assets. When the guy's away on a trip, maybe he doesn't want his wife to look beautiful, so the other guys don't look at her. And so therefore, we do not. So this is important, so we see a very basic distinction between absolute legal obligation, no matter what, whether he said so or not. We take his assets and other things that are not the basic, not absolute legal obligations, but dependent on his decision. Okay, now we finally ask, "My davar acher?" What is this other thing that we mentioned? Rav Chisda amar zeh tachshit. As we said, this is jewelry, cosmetics, perfumes. Rav Yosef amar tzedakah. It's talking about charity funds. So in those days, there was a tax that was imposed by the rabbis, by the nasi, or the exilarch, on everyone, that they had to give a certain amount to the communal charity organization to help out the communal funds. So can the Bet Din, if the guy went away on a trip or he's insane, can the Bet Din go and extract money for this other thing? So according to this opinion, it's tax. So that would mean, according to if the guy's insane, then we assume he always pays tax. He has to pay the tax, so he would continue to pay the tax. If the guy went away on a trip, then we do not go and take his money. Maybe he's giving the tax from where he is away on a trip. So we can't assume that he wants the tax to be given. All right, so what's the difference between these two, Rav Chisda and Rav Yosef? Man damar tachshit kol sheken tzedakah. If you say that he would not want to pay for his woman's ornaments, and so we don't take it from him, all the more so we should assume that he also would not want charity taken from his funds, because maybe he's giving it elsewhere. But the other opinion that says the davar acher is tzedakah, and so we would take tzedakah from him if he became insane. All the more so we would extract money for the jewelry. But also the other guy who went away on a trip, the one who says that we're only talking about tzedakah, means, okay, we don't take tzedakah from him. Who knows? Maybe he gave it over there. But cosmetics, since this Tanah does not include cosmetics on the list, we assume that the Bet Din can extract money for her cosmetics, because he would not want his wife to be demeaned, even though he's away. He wants his wife to be happy, and therefore we do not take the tzedakah, but we do take we do take money for the cosmetics. Good. Amar Rav Chia bar Avin Amar Rav Huna mishalach midatayam umeta ishto Bet Din yordin linchasav vekobdin ota lefi kebodo velo lefi keboda. So now another statement about using funds for the wife's burial. A man went on a trip, and while he was away on a trip, his wife died. So now the man has responsibility to provide for his wife's funeral, but he's not around. So the Bet Din will go into his assets, and they will pay for her funeral according to his dignity. According to his level. So now we wonder, wait a second, why according to his level and not according to her level? Right? Didn't we say before that we should follow her level? No, what we mean is also according to his level, meaning whichever one is higher, her level or his level, whichever is higher, the Bet Din can extract money for that, if that includes flutes or whatever it is. So we see that according to Rav Huna, he gives a pasak halacha here that she gets the higher amount both while she's alive and also while she's dead. She gets to enjoy the higher level of living, and which was the halacha we said. That was the Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah that said that. And so that is the halacha here as well. So that's why the Bet Din can extract money, and if either one of them usually has flutes, then the husband's assets will have to pay for them. Amar Rav Matana ha'omer imeta lo tikberuha min nechasav shom'ayin lo. Rav Matana teaches that if a man is on his deathbed and he says, "Listen, I'm about to die, but I'm telling my inheritors that if and when my wife dies, when my wife dies, I don't want her to be buried from my money." So if the husband is alive and his wife dies, then he's obligated to pay for the funeral. That's in the Ketubah. But once the man dies, then all his assets go to his sons or whoever is going to inherit him. And the inheritors, the sons, do not have an obligation to bury their father's wife. It could be their mother, it could be their stepmother, but they do not have a basic obligation. So therefore, Shom'in Lo, we listen to it. How will she be buried? Well, when she dies, she will receive a ketuvah payout, that will go to her. So that from that money, so from that money, they can take a sum in order to pay for a funeral rites. So that is a basic law. So therefore, that's true. We listen to him. Now we ask, this is so basic. Why he doesn't even have to say it? What's the difference when he says so? What? Because the property goes to the orphans, and the orphans they don't have an obligation. Even if the father on his deathbed says, "I don't want my money to pay for my wife's funeral," even if he doesn't say so, it would still be the law, because his assets, except for the money that will go to pay the ketubah, his assets go to his sons, and his sons do not have to pay for their mother or stepmother's funeral if they don't want to. So what is Rab Matana actually teaching us? Ela ha'omer, rather we're going to reword what he taught. A person on his deathbed says when he dies, is a euphemism. If he means when I die, he doesn't want to say give himself a curse, even though he is about to die. So when he says, when I die, do not bury me from my property. I don't want to pay for my own burial. That's what he says. He's so stingy, or he doesn't want his kids to have to waste money on his funeral. So en shom'in lo, we do not listen to him. Lav kol hemenud sheyashir et banav yapil asmo ala sibur, because he does not have the power. We're not going to allow him to make his sons rich and now put himself as a burden on the community by saying, "I'm not going to pay for my funeral." Well, we're not going to just leave him unburied. The funeral society, the communal funds will pay for anyone who cannot afford it. Yeah. So by him saying that he's actually allowing his sons to keep that money and putting a burden on the communal funds, and that is not fair. If he's so poor, fine. But if he has the funds, then we do not pay attention to his directive, and we take the money from them, and we force the sons to pay for their father's funeral. All right, next Mishnah. Leolam hi b'rshut ha'av ad she'tikanes lirshut ha'ba'al lenisu'in. So we're trying to figure out exactly when the handoff happens. We know that from the time of Kiddushin, so she's already designated to be his wife eventually, but they're not yet married. So the marriage happens in a number of steps, and which step is more important for which law? So as long as she's living in her father's house, usually during Kiddushin, she's living in her father's house, so she's still under her father's domain for most things. And then there's going to be some kind of official handoff where she is taken from her father's house and brought to the husband or to the husband's house or to messengers of the husband of some sort. And then there's going to be the chuppah ceremony, and eventually they're going to consummate. And so each of these are different stages of the nisu'in. So this Mishnah teaches that she remains in the father's domain, authority, until she enters the domain of haba'al le-nisu'in, until the marriage. There are other versions of this that say lechuppah. So that would define it even better as chuppah. And actually this Mishnah itself is quoted in a few lines saying chuppah here rather than la ba'al lenisu'in. Okay, now, masara av l'shiduchei ha'ba'al harehi b'rshut ha'ba'al. Now, a first step that is still an important step is if the father hands off the daughter to the messengers of the husband. They may live far away, and so the husband says, "Okay, I'm ready for marriage." And so he doesn't want to go all the way. He sends a messenger on his behalf as an agent to the father, and the father says, "Here you go, I hand off my daughter." Right? This is kind of like in a modern wedding ceremony when the bride marches down, and then the husband goes and meets them halfway, and the parents give over their daughter, and they go ahead, and now that's the official handoff. So the husband doesn't have to do it himself. He could send messengers to do that. So that becomes, she goes under the authority of the husband from that point. Now, what if there's a combination, both people, halacha av im shiluchei habal, or shalchu shiluchei ha'av im shiluchei habal? If the father went along with the messengers of the husband, so now they're all walking together back to the husband's house, but the father's also with them. So is she under the father's jurisdiction, or under the messengers of the husband? Or the messengers of the father go with the messengers of the husband. So now, since she's being accompanied by both, it's not clear what it is. So she remains under the father's jurisdiction. She only gets, the transfer only takes effect when the father or his messengers stop. They go back home, and when she's exclusively under the authority of the husband or the husband's messengers, that's when the transfer happens. If the messengers of the father give her over to the messengers of the husband, so even though the father and the husband are not even around, that also does transfer the authority to the husband. Okay. So now we start off, my le'olam. We started the Mishnah with saying the words le'olam. She is always under the authority of the father. It sounds like it's including some kind of case that we might not have thought of beforehand. So my le'olam lapuke mishnah rishona ditnan higia zeman velo nisu ochlot mishelo veochlot bitruma kamashmalan le'olam. There's a mishnah that we're going to see soon on 57a that says if the time came and they still did not get married, generally they would do kiddushin at some point, and then perhaps up to a year later, they would do nisu'in. So what if the time of nisu'in came and the husband is supposed to bring her in and start paying for all of her needs, but they didn't get married for some reason. The husband had a business trip, he had to go and he couldn't do it. Even though he didn't do nisu'in, since the time came, he now starts his responsibility and has to pay for her food. So she eats from him. And she can even eat terumah. So according to that Mishnah, she eats everything, even terumah. So our Mishnah is coming to say that was the earlier law, but it's not the halacha. Kamashmalan le'olam. Le'olam here means she remains under her father's authority always until she actually enters the wedding canopy, and therefore she will not be able to eat terumah in the meantime, even though the time came and he has now financial responsibility. But you can't tell me that she's going to eat terumah when she's in her father's house before she actually goes into her husband's house, assuming that she is a Bat Yisrael marrying a Kohen. Now, Masar ha'av l'shluchei ha'baal, harehi b'rshut ha'baal. Amar Rav mesirata lakol chutz mi teruma. So when we say that the father delivered her into the messengers of the husband, now she goes into the husband's authority. For what laws is this true? Is this for everything or only for some things? So Rav says it's for everything, except for the eating of terumah, because the wedding didn't happen yet, so she's not fully married, and so she cannot yet eat terumah. The reasoning seems to be that since they didn't have the wedding canopy and consummate the marriage yet, we're always afraid that during the consummation of the marriage, he may see some blemish on her skin or something and say, "Oh, you didn't tell me about that. Mekach ta'ut, this whole marriage is off." And then retroactively, if she had been eating terumah before the wedding, since the wedding is retroactively annulled, that would be in prohibition. So therefore we say, you know what, hold off on eating terumah. We want to make sure that the wedding is really going to stick, that it's not a mekach ta'ut, and so only from the consummation and on, according to Rav, that's when you can start eating teruma. Okay, that's one opinion. Rav Aseh Amad Afli teruma. Rav Aseh says once the husband hands off his daughter to the messengers of the husband, that's it. She's already in the husband's domain, and even for the law of teruma, she can start eating. Rav Aseh's reasoning would be that while she's in her father's house, we don't want her to eat teruma because if she does, she's eating teruma there. She's going to be having lunch in the father's house, which is teruma food. And even if technically she can eat it, but there's people around who are going to say, oh, that looks good, and they'll start having it. But they are not kohanim. And so therefore, while she's in her father's house, no. But once she's transferred into the domain of the husband, even if it's not physically in the house, but just under the messengers, then we don't have to worry about that. And that is sufficient. Now she can start eating teruma. Now we have a challenge to Rav Aseh, who says basically the handoff is sufficient for everything, even teruma. Iti be Rav Huna l'Rav Aseh ve'amri la Chiya barav le-Rav Aseh. We know the question was asked to Rav Aseh. It's not clear if it was Rav Huna or Chiya, the son of Rav, who asked the question. And the question is, Le'olam hi b'rshut ha'av'ad shetikanes la'chuppah. The Mishnah, the opening of our Mishnah says, she remains under the authority of the father until she enters chuppah. You see that the language that it's quoting here is different from our version of the Mishnah that said l'rshut ha'ba'al le'nisu'in. Here it says la'chuppah. Okay, so assuming that chuppah is at least the version that Rav Huna or Chiya had, and a couple of manuscripts do have the word chuppah even in the Mishnah. Anyway, his point is that the transfer does not happen, the full transfer to the husband does not happen until the chuppah, which means the wedding ceremony, and not beforehand when they just pass off to the wife to the messengers. So this is a challenge to Rav Aseh, who says that the transfer is sufficient for all matters of authority, and the husband is full authority even for teruma. Hold on, here it says chuppah. Amar lehu Rav. Now Rav says to the questioners, who was either Rav Huna, his student, or Chiya, his son, chastises them about this question. It says, Lav amina lechu la tizlu batar ipcha. Didn't I always tell you, don't follow something that can be interpreted ipcha in an opposite manner. Don't ask a question from an ambiguous source. And that's exactly what you did here. Yachol shanuye lechu, because Rav Aseh could give you a simple answer. Mesirata zohi kenisata lechuppah. He can say the word chuppah is kind of ambiguous, even though it technically means the wedding canopy, which sounds like the wedding ceremony itself. But he could tell you that when we say entering the chuppah, it means not literally, physically, the actual walking into the wedding canopy, which in those days might be the wedding house that are built for the chatan and kala, where they'll stay for a while. But it could be it could be any transfer. So therefore, even the transfer from the father or his messengers to the husband or his messengers, Rav Aseh would also call that chuppah, and therefore say, yes, she remains under the authority of the father until chuppah equals the transfer. So it's really important because, we're dealing with different stages, but the basic idea of nisu'in fundamentally is she's leaving her father's domain and entering the husband's domain, and that could be done by this kind of transfer of custody, or a symbolic hut, or an actual house that they go and live in. All right, so all that was a couple opinions so far. Now we're going to have more opinions. Ushmuel amad lirushata, the transfer from his message, from the father to the husband's messengers, or he himself, that affects Yerusha. That once the husband or his messengers, we'll just call it the transfer, happen, then the husband can, if she dies, from that point forward, the husband inherits whatever she has. Or whatever her property she has, whatever she brings into the marriage. So Shmuel seems to be giving this transfer less status. It's not going to be for teruma, not going to be for other matters. It sounds like it's just for inheritance. Resh Lakish amar lichtubata. Ketubata maihi. Resh Lakish says for ketubah. Now we ask, ketubah includes a lot of things. What part of the ketubah does the transfer effectuate? If he means the inheritance, that part of the ketubah that says that she will inherit, that he, the husband, will inherit her, that's what Shemuel already said. So then it would be the same thing. Why would he have to say so? Just say Yerusha. So Amar Ravina lomar ketubata me'acher maneh. Ravina says the transfer is sufficient on a very low level. This transfer only will affect her in a next marriage. If she divorces or is widowed from this guy, and she goes and marries a second guy later on, will she be considered a betula or almana? Well, technically, she was only transferred to the messengers. There was no chuppah yet. There was no bi'ah, certainly. So she does still have bitulim. So therefore, you might think that she would deserve 200 in her next marriage. Therefore, Ravina is explaining, Resh Lakish is saying, no, because the transfer happened, she's called Nesu'ah, and therefore she will be treated like an almana in the next marriage. So that for the next marriage, even though physically she has betulim, because the transfer happened, that's sufficient to call her already previously married, and therefore deserves only 100. Okay, so according to Resh Lakish, it sounds like the transfer affects even less than all the other opinions above. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina damre tarvayu mesirata lakol after teruma. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina in Eretz Yisrael, they both say that the transfer effectuates a full marriage, all obligations and all rights, even that she can eat teruma. This would agree with Rav Aseh that we saw at first. All right, now we're going to have a challenge to all or most of these opinions. Metibeh. This is a Tosefta. That's pretty long. The next 3 paragraphs. Halach ha'av im sheluchei ha'ba'al, or shalchu sheluchei ha'av im sheluchei ha'ba'al. If the father goes with the messengers of the husband, or the messengers of the father with the messengers of the husband, so now they're all together, so she's never quite alone with the messengers of the husband yet. The father or his messengers are still with her, so she didn't leave her father's domain yet. Or they're walking on the way, the husband and the husband and the wife, the future husband and wife, and they stop off on the way. Right, he went to pick her up, and they stop off on the way, I guess, to his house, and they stay in a courtyard that's owned by her. Then they're going to sleep there for the night. Now, since it's owned by her, that will not affect kiddushin. We're going to contrast that with the next line where it's owned by him. If he owns the house where they're going to stay the night, then that is nisuin. If they have in mind that will be for nisuin. But because she owns it, so then when they go in, we assume that they're going in just to rest for a while until they continue their journey. But the fact that they're resting in the same space does not mean that they intend to get married. So therefore, in all these cases, even though the ketubah, this is referring to the dowry, the things that the father of the bride gives to the couple, even if all that stuff, the furniture, bed sheets and things, are already in the husband's house, physically they're there, but since the transfer was not effectuated, if she dies in the meantime, her father will inherit all that, gets the dowry back, gets whatever property she had, gets back, because he or his messengers were still with them the whole time, even if they stayed over in a place together. It was her, she owned the place. That none of that is called a transfer. There's no nisuin that happened. Second paragraph, if the father did give her over to the messengers of the husband, or his messengers gave her over to the messenger of the husband, and they went back home, he or his messengers, the fathers, went back home, and now she's alone, she's exclusively with he or the husband's messengers, that's a transfer. Or they're going on the way and they go on a rest, and he has a courtyard that he owns, the husband owns, and they rest there. and they go there for the purpose of nisuin. Well, that itself is a transfer, because now they are staying together in his domain. That's a definition of nisuin. In this case, even if the physical dowry is still in her father's house, all that stuff, all the swanny stuff is still with him, nevertheless, at that point when she dies, transfer happened, that is sufficient nisuin for inheritance, and therefore the husband can go pick up, even after the wife's death, can go pick up all that stuff from her father's house. When is this true that the husband can inherit? Lirushata. When is this true? Lirushata. Aval litruma. In other words, when do we say that the husband has a right? In what case do we say that the nisuin happened, the transfer is effective? Only for inheritance. But regarding eating teruma, no, that does not effectuate until the actual wedding ceremony, and that's the full nisuin that you need for eating of teruma. All right, that's the end of the Tosefta. The Gemara says, "Tiyufta dekulehu tiyufta." This Tosefta goes against all of the Amoraim that we saw before, because it's kind of in between. Yes, for Yerusha, but not for Teruma. Now, actually, if you look carefully, it's not really so clear, because it says yes Teruma, yes for Yerusha, not for Teruma, but it doesn't really say anything about the other aspects of her right, his rights over her, that are not mentioned here, that were mentioned above, and so it's not really clear if it's rejecting all the opinions above. According to Rashi, this Tosefta does fit with Shemuel's opinion above. Right? Remember, Shemuel said for Yerusha, yes for Yerusha, and not for Teruma. So it could fit with Shemuel. So maybe when it says that the Tiyufta of all of them, it doesn't mean literally it rejects everybody, but rejects most of the opinions above. Certainly it will reject Rav Aseh and Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina, because they say that the transfer affects even Teruma, and here it says for sure not Teruma. So they're probably the main challenge is to them, who were just mentioned right above it. Okay, Ha Gufa Kashya. We ask about this within the Tosefta. We seem to have an internal contradiction. Amat Nichnesa Imo Lalin Tama de Lalin Hasetama Leshem Nisuin. In the first paragraph, if they go to her courtyard for the purpose just of resting, and not nisuin, so there's no transfer. It sounds like the reason why there's no transfer there, that's not considered a nisuin, is because they had explicitly said, we're going to go here just to rest, not for marriage. Therefore, we can infer hasitama. If they didn't say anything, then and they went to her courtyard, then we assume that it would be for marriage. But in the Sefa, in the next case, if they go to his courtyard and they specify this will be for Nisu'in, then they are married. But if they don't specify anything, then we would assume that it's only lodging. So now which one is it? If you don't specify and the husband and wife go into, the fiancés go into a place and are there together, do we assume that if we don't specify, is that just for resting, or is it for nisuin? And the answer is Amad Asher, Setame Ketane. Both of them are actually stam, that they didn't specify anything. And the rest of the words are just explaining what we assume if they don't specify anything. Stam Hased Lalin, if it's her courtyard and they don't specify anything, then we assume they're just resting. It's not for nisuin, unless they specify and say, you know what, we're doing this for nisuin. But Stam Hased Nisuin. But if he owns the courtyard and they don't say anything, then we assume it's nisuin, unless they specifically say, listen, we're going to sleep here together in my courtyard, but we don't intend for this to be a marriage ceremony. This is only for resting. We're going to save that for another time. Now we have one more halacha regarding this transferring. Tana masara av l'shlucha bal v'zineta harezo bechanek. If this transfer happened from the father to the messengers of the husband, and while after that time, before the actual wedding ceremony, she goes and sleeps with someone else and is unfaithful, she gets chanek. Chanek is the normal punishment for adultery after nisuin. So the point is that after that transfer, she's considered enough like nisuin that she would get chenek and not sikila, which would be the usual punishment for an arusa. So she's no longer arusa, she becomes a nisu'ah. Mina hanemile, how do you know this? Amar Rabbi Ameh bad achama, amar kedal. This is not bet aviha. In the law of Mosi Shemra, it says we stone her because she did this bad thing, that she went astray in her father's house, which means she only gets stoning if she's in her father's house. That excludes but if the father already gave her over and transferred her to the messengers of the husband, then she's not in her father's house anymore, so she can't get stoning. Therefore, she already gets strangulation. Now, says, hold on, I know it's excluding something, bet aviha, but why are you jumping all the way back to the point of transfer? There's another milestone that happens in between, and that is after the wedding canopy, but before the consummation of the marriage through bi'ah. So there also, the bi'ah is the final 100% marriage. But before that, with just the wedding canopy, that is already a step before. Maybe it's excluding, coming to exclude that. That is after the canopy, then she gets chenek. But maybe before the canopy, even after the transfer, it would still be sikila. So how do you know? Amarava amali ami chupa beheja ketiba. Says no, we wouldn't need this pasuk. It's not bedavia to teach me after chupa, because after chupa I have another explicit source that tells me after chupa she is fully married and no longer would get sikila like a na'ara. Because it says, Ki na'ara betula me'orasa le'ish. This is in the law of na'ara me'orasa, the one after Mosi Shemra. Pasuk says, if she is a na'ara, she has to be between 12 and 12 and a half, betula, and she has to be me'orasa. These three words each come to exclude something. Na'ara velo bogeret. Na'ara and not more than 12 and a half. Once she's 12 and a half, she would get chaynek and she cheats. She gets chaynek and not tikila anymore. Betula velo be'ola. Betula comes to say she still has her betulim. She's virgin. Not be'ola if she already had bi'ah. Me'orasa velo nesu'ah. Me'orasa means she's in the Erusin period and she's not fully married. Now, my nesu'ah, what does it mean nesu'ah? Ilema nesu'ah mamash. If nesu'ah means actual bi'ah, and only from that point on, she goes from sikilaf to chenek. Hainu betula velo be'ola. Well, then the su'ah would be the same as the previous one, betula velo be'ola. That's also that already would already tell us that at the point of bi'ah, she leaves the sikila punishment and would enter the chenek punishment. So I already know that. What is nisu'ah coming to add? Rather, the word nisu'ah must be adding the case where she had chuppah, they did the wedding ceremony, but they didn't yet consummate with bi'ah. Even then, she is no longer under the law of na'ara me'orasa and no longer would be sikila. So therefore, I know that milestone is already covered. And so this pasuk that says he's not bet aviha is coming to add yet something else, that only when she is in her father's home would she get sikila. So once the transfer happens, that she's no longer in her father's home, and the punishment at that point on would be chanek. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.